So Angela Lombardi is our next speaker. She's the Director of Outreach and Audience Engagement from North Carolina Museum of Art in the USA, and she will elaborate on the museum as Refuge.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak and allowing me to represent the North Carolina Museum of Art here on the stage. How's everybody doing? Okay, good. Just checking in, making sure everyone is all right. I am a little sleepy, I must admit, but it's because of the jet lag, not because of the amazing presentations. I've learned so much, and I feel that it has informed even my presentation going forward tonight. Knowing all of the work that is happening around the world, I'm realizing how much we in the United States have to do to catch up. This is new work to us in our museum. So I'll just tell you a little bit about my role. I serve as the Director of Outreach and Audience Engagement, which means I work within the walls of the museum with the public programs team that looks at family programming, studio programming, teen and college programming, the programming of our 164-acre park, as well as outreach to rural parts of the state outside of the museum and building relationships with diverse communities outside the walls of the museum. So I was going to have you close your eyes. Don't do that. I was going to have you close your eyes and imagine your favorite museum, walking into the most beautiful gallery that you've ever walked into that lives in your memory, and just feeling that feeling of peace that you get when you walk into a space. So if you can picture that space, this is my building. This is where I work. And just understanding that as you do walk in, you might experience a sense of calm. You might experience a slowing down of your life so that you're not really dealing with the distractions of your normal day. You're thinking about the art. You're thinking maybe about taking some deep breaths. I think that this is largely the benefit, the passive benefit of an art museum. This kind of comes with us setting the stage. Through programming, we're asking everyone to slow down. We're asking them to maybe put their phones down. There's not a barrage of information that happens out in the world. You're really there to look, to think, to possibly have conversations with loved ones, people that are close to you. And this is another semi-passive benefit of the museum. The curators and the art handlers and the conservators would call this not passive. This is their active daily work to maintain these objects in our collection. What you're looking at here are people interacting with the art of the museum after a massive reinstallation that we underwent this year. So our museum was closed for 5 months while we took everything off the walls and rehung it so that it would possibly be more relevant to people coming in and having an experience that was self-guided and not so strictly geographical and chronological, but there's objects mixed from different collections, thematic galleries, the number one being performing arts. And so it is looking at arts from across different disciplines represented within our collection. What we're trying to do here as well is not give as many formalized tours. I don't know how tours work in your institutions, but a lot of school children in North Carolina have their first tour with possibly an elderly woman who has retired from being a school teacher or an art teacher or anything like that, and is giving them a tour where they don't talk, they stay in line, they don't raise their voices, they don't get out of formation, and they learn about art history. We think that we're doing a great thing by doing this, but is that relevant to young children? I don't know. You can ask them in 20 years and they'll tell you what their first reaction was to a museum visit. Was it something that they liked, or did they feel like they were going to get in trouble the whole time? So what we tried to do is reimagine how people are experiencing the museum, and one of the ways that we're doing that is inviting artists in to talk about the work in the museum. I myself have a background as a studio artist, and so as I'm designing experiences for our museum, I'm trying to think as an artist. I'm trying to think about these objects as something that another human has created with their hands. I know that process, I love that process, and therefore I love being in that space myself and just looking at the marks that people make, looking at something, even if it's a, thousands years of history in an ancient Egyptian object, or it's a Greek vase. We know that somebody's hands made that. And if we can form those connections, often through the voice of artists, we're going to get closer to that kind of empathetic experience that we're going to hope that will leave a mark on these young people or on anyone who visits the museum. So if you've never been to a museum before, you might not have that immediate response of peace and calm. You might not know that you're welcome. This happens a lot at our museum because it is a state museum. It is free and open to the public, but a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people don't understand that they are allowed to bring children to our space, that they can have conversations. It's not a church. It's not a silent space. And what we've heard a lot from the community is that it really matters who invited you to have that experience. If you're finding it by yourself, you really don't know what to expect. But if a trusted member of your community or a community leader has said, let's go together, or you yourself as a museum employee have been outside the walls of the museum, have made the relationships that allow you to invite someone in yourself, and they bring family, that's an entirely different experience. And we're working to build more of those experiences into our museum's life. But then when you take it one step further and you start centering people's needs for connection, for social engagement, for that moment of reflection, for health, you're going to have a much better reaction. You're going to have people come to you afterwards and say, that's not what I expected to get out of this visit. I really found something in myself, or I had this conversation that was hard to have in another arena of my life. And they might come back. That museum engagement then meant something to them that augmented their life and augmented their state of well-being, and that's what we're also going for. So, as I mentioned before, we have a 164-acre sculpture park that surrounds our museum. And during the pandemic, all of the area parks closed down during lockdown. Our park remained open, and people used it. That park was packed. I think we had over 1 million visitors during the year of 2020. They were very respectful of each other's socially distanced picnics that they were having out there. They would have dance parties. They would exercise. Young mothers would bring their children to exercise in the park. All kinds of spontaneous things were happening. And so as we ourselves, as museum workers, came back to the building, we were able to go out into the park and talk to people and say, what is it that brought you here today? What would you like to see more of? And then we were able to create more intentional experiences for people that weren't happenstance. It wasn't, I decided to come here for a picnic. It was, I can order a picnic in the cafe and I can meet people here and we can all sit outside. This is a structured thing. I didn't bring my portable speaker today. The amphitheater has music playing, and it's called NCMA Groove, and people are out there having a dance party. And so that was really one of those benefits of the pandemic that gave us really renewed flexibility to implement programs that maybe we would have thought of eventually, but I don't know. I don't know that we would have had that much community input, and so it really did help us to be more flexible and responsive. So here you can see some of the things that are happening in the park now. We're having big fitness classes. We have people dancing and putting on performances. And in the lower corner there, that's our amphitheater, and we have outdoor concerts, and people have come back. I have to tell you, the first concert that we had back, people were so awkward. People were standing there next to each other like, all right, we can talk to each other, we're kind of enjoying this music, but we aren't quite ready for this large of a social experience. And so, even our audience had to ease back into it, and we had to be really receptive to how they were feeling, and so that we could be intentional with how we were reaching them. This is my lovely colleague, Brianne Sinor, and she has been our yogi, as you can tell, and our leader in our Mindful Museum program. Our Mindful Museum programs encompass yoga, tai chi, adaptive chair yoga for those with disabilities in our community, as well as you can see restorative circles, full moon walks, and sensory slow art. And so with sensory slow art, we're sending out kits that people can experience while they're doing an online program. How many of you are familiar with slow art? Couple? Okay, great. So with our slow art program, we started during the pandemic, and we had hour-long Zoom meetings, which doesn't sound fun, but it really was incredibly beneficial, where we looked at one work of art for an hour and one work only and discussed it. We opened it up for discussion. We weren't starting out with, this work was created in 1865 by blah, blah, blah. And we opened it by, a meditative moment of deep breathing and calming, centering, and then gently opened it up for people to respond with the response to, what do you see? And then, why are you saying that? And what's making you feel that? And these were sometimes up to 80 people in the Zoom. Not all of them would speak, but some of them would, really jump in and offer these really deeply personal reactions to the art that they were looking at. And that allowed the next person to share something that they weren't quite ready to share, but then they heard that and then they opened up. And so Slow Art became a program that actually worked better online than in person, because you can't have 80 people crowded around an object and willing to discuss, but on Zoom you can get in and see details, you can really spend time. People who aren't happy or feeling comfortable raising their voices can get in the chat and tell you everything that they're feeling. So that was one program that we really loved, and we've continued on Zoom. I'm not sure how online engagement has gone with you all after opening your doors again, but for us it just plummeted. People did not want to be on the computer any more than they had to be, and especially our programs for young people just went away. And I can't say I'm too sorry about that, because it was great to have them back in the building and meet them face to face. So one of the programs that Bree does is a full moon walk, and I just want to tell you a story of a participant that was there one night with her as they walked around the park. It's just what it sounds like. There's a full moon, and you walk the paths with a guide. You talk about the sculptures. You talk about being together in the environment, the night air, the sounds you hear. And there was an elderly gentleman there with his wife, and Bree didn't really pay much attention, but they were there, and she asked something about the sounds that they were hearing, and there were all of these spring frogs singing in the night. And she asked the question, does anyone know what that noise is? And the woman who was there spoke up, and she talked at length about these frogs. And Bree thought, oh, that's great. She knew what that was, and moved on, and there was a nice quiet space. Later, Bree received an email from the husband and said, my wife has advanced Alzheimer's and aphasia, and that was the first sentence she's put together in a very, very long time. And I just want you to know that it might not have been much to you, but it meant the world to me and to her. And just that you had created that space for that moment to happen, we didn't expect that to happen at a museum, and so thank you for that. We were all incredibly touched, and also he then later wrote to us to let us know that she had passed away. And it was just that kind of feeling of community connection that really powers what we do. It makes it important, and it makes it personal, and it drives you to the next experience. Another important part of the work that we do is collaboration with community partners. And so this gentleman here is named Michael Williams, and he's the founder of the Black on Black Project, which works with artists of color. He's a curator, and he curates shows of art around different themes. He also works on short films and spoken word and dance performances. So when the murder of George Floyd occurred in the United States, that was sparked by US protests, followed by worldwide protests. And our own city of Raleigh was rocked by protests. And we immediately knew that we, as a predominantly white institution in the South, weren't the ones to be speaking up about that. But our work with Michael Williams allowed us access to a community that really needed a moment of healing, that one incident, those multiple incidents that years of institutionalized racism had brought to the surface. And so what happened was we invited him to screen one of his films, which was called Will of the Father, which you see the still from right here, that discussed the legacy of slavery within the city of Raleigh in North Carolina, where we lived. These gentlemen are on the grounds of a mental hospital, a former mental hospital. This place has had many, many lives. Former mental hospital previously was a plantation, one of the largest plantations in the area. There were many enslaved people that lived there, died there, and were buried anonymously there. So you can see the markers there were the people that were passed along, the humans that were passed along in the will of this man who died, and so they were his property. They went along in the will. And so what this program and film talked about was that type of intergenerational trauma that, if not addressed, does manifest in very angry protests when something, again, happens in that community, when that pain is relived again and again. And so one thing that was really important about this performance and panel discussion was that we made the choice as museum staff to not be visible and not be present. We just turned the space over, we turned the stage over to an all-black panel of speakers that went into that history and went into some therapy and some aspects of the healing that the community could do to understand what the origin of that pain was, as opposed to just a knee-jerk reaction to protests in the community. This is another program that we have that is for younger audiences, and it is called Creative Processing. The woman standing up between the tables is Natalia Torres de Valle, and she works with our family manager, Courtney Clemens, and together they have created this program that is Creative Processing, which deals with difficult topics that are hard to talk about, with young children as a family, but came up a lot during the pandemic. So grief and sadness and depression and loss, and typically you're not building children's programs around those themes. But when you're working with an art therapist, and Natalia is a licensed art therapist, you can bring that in through an introduction with objects and with art making and process-based art making. Someone brought this up earlier, and I'm sorry for not remembering exactly who it was, but we were talking about the relevance of using our own collections as we're doing this mindfulness work. And this is something that we do quite a bit at our institution because that's where our funding is tied. And so we have a particular endowment that deals with outreach. And so we try to use that over and over again to use objects in our collection to start these conversations. And it's been beneficial for us as we look at those objects in our daily work lives, and then also to the participants as they're able to come in and maybe revisit that object later. So this particular program was happening in response to yet another mass shooting in the United States. And this was the Uvalde shooting that really shook the country. Not that every single one of them doesn't, but this one was really hard with so many young children dying. And what we found was that we as a staff needed to process that event and that grief, and just being there at work that day, we said it's too much for us to hold, and so what is the community dealing with? How are we going to bring the community in to also process the way that we're processing with each other? And we had the opportunity to create a program out in the park where people were able to come and sit together and talk about grief and loss and their anger over police violence, and the racially motivated killings of other hate crimes in the United States at that time. And we were able to come out hopeful because we were there in community. All of us had that burden alone in our homes, but being able to sit together and talk about it together gave us the sense, very literally, that we were not alone in those conversations and in those feelings. So one of the other benefits of having a conversation like that is that's not the only conversation you have. When you're dealing with difficult topics, it kind of balloons into other things and bleeds into other areas. And so if you're listening to someone talk, you're able to know, oh, that's something that this person has said and that person has brought up and this person mentioned, and so maybe our next program needs to address that. And so again, we're in conversation with our community and able to be responsive and creating the programs that they need. This is Ashley Witherspoon, who I work with, who works with a lot of museums, and she was the one who brought us the research and information on museums as social prescriptions. And with her right now, I'm working on a college program where we're doing just that. We're using the museum as a social prescription for university students. It is designed to address isolation and anxiety, depression, all of the things that come with being away from home for the first time in a new place with new people. And again, those conversations are difficult, but if you start it by the observation of a work of art and your feelings about that, it again blossoms into a larger conversation about mental health and mental wellness. This painting on the right is a mother well that is in our collection, and I have a friend who uses this painting as therapy all the time. And he came in, I mean, there's many, many ways you can look at that painting and imagine, but it's connected to a certain person in his life that he lost. And this was that person's favorite painting. And so by coming back to visit this gallery, he's able to talk to me, talk to friends, talk to anyone about his friend that he lost, because it is tied to that painting and his emotional feelings and connection to that work of art. And I know that that's one story out of all of the objects that we have in that collection, and people have personal connections to a lot of them, and we have to make space to hear those stories and make them relevant. So here's the mission statement of our museum, because as a museum in the south of the United States, I'm going to try to get this right, it's an anomaly. This is the first state institution in the United States that has been funded through legislative monies, and it was there to buy art in the 1940s. That's how our collection started in 1947. And it was not what it is today. I'm seen here with our director. She came in from the Guggenheim about 4 years ago and really changed the direction of the museum. Together we wrote a strategic plan, and when I say together, I mean all staff. This strategic plan wasn't written by strategists and handed down. We all sat together and decided what our values were going to be, what our goals were going to be, and how we were going to work to achieve those together. So this is what it looked like in the early days. This was in 1947, and the North Carolina General Assembly appropriated $1 million for the purchase of works of art. With this appropriation, the General Assembly became the first legislature in the United States to set aside funds for an art collection for its citizens. And so we call this the People's Collection. It's owned by the people. My favorite thing is when a little kid comes in and they say, "Oh, I didn't know I could be in here." I said, "This is yours. This is your museum. You own this." And you should see the change on their faces. So one representative famously said this, "Mr. Speaker, I know I'm facing a hostile audience." He didn't think that this was going to go through, but man cannot live by bread alone. And we all in the arts and the cultural sector know that is true. So we can't live by bread alone. We can't live with art on the walls only. We need interpretation. We need outreach. We need to build those relationships that bring people back to us by going outside of our walls and meeting them and inviting them back in. I'll quickly wrap up. This is out in the world. This is in a very rural community in North Carolina where these young people worked with an artist to create art. Then they were able to sell it at a large festival in their community. And you can see how proud and happy they are and how happy I am to be out there working with them. That's my favorite place to be. So thank you very much. Thank you for your commitment to your work, and thank you for supporting all of us.
Thank you so much.